Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AirlineGeeks Podcast. My name is John McDermott, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Fanny Gibertini.
Hello, everybody.
In the U.S. this week, we've heard from a number of airlines that have decided to furlough huge amounts of staff once the CARES Act funding that they received from the government runs out at the end of September. And one of the most notable airlines that we've heard from is Delta Airlines, who will furlough about 2,000 pilots or so on October 1st. To discuss this development and to expand it to some other Delta revelations we've heard recently, we'd like to welcome Pablo Diaz, who is one of our writers here at AirlineGeeks.com. Pablo, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So we know that they'll furlough about 2,000 or so pilots once the CARES Act runs dry. What can you tell us?
Basically, the outlook for the industry is getting worse, and it's not going to be any better for when we reach October 1st. So Delta is anticipating like almost 2,000 furloughs on that date. The head of operations, John Lafter, has said quite correctly. I mean, there is in all this time, just a quarter of the demand was recovered, and there is no perspective for that demand to be recovering in a pace that will allow to maintain those jobs.
Is Delta planning to furlough any other positions besides just pilots, or do we really only know about the 2,000 pilots that they announced on Tuesday?
Well, the reductions were important in several areas, right? But one of the claims that the unions have is that this process to furlough employees is impacting directly on unionized sectors and especially pilots. So perhaps the first wave of attrition, I mean the people that were in voluntary leave or choose to retire, it was a little more evenly spread, but this particular wave is going to impact in pilots and crews most likely.
So we know that Delta needs about 4,500 pilots moving forward from now, down from about 11,000. But we also know that both unions and airlines like Delta are lobbying Congress for an extension to CARES Act funding. Do you think that we could see an extension of these fundings anytime soon? And kind of where do you think we are, and what should we expect on that?
Yeah, the thing is that even if CARES Act gets extended until March next year, it is going to provide a relief, of course, but it is not without a health insurance, a health certainty of when this is going to be back to normal, and I will use several quotation marks in that normal word. It is more a question of when these furloughs are going to be implemented, rather than if they are going to be implemented. I mean, if the demand is not recovering anytime soon, we will be seeing this not only in Delta, I mean, in any major airline, in any airline at all. I mean, not only major airlines. The numbers are frightening because the staff is really big, but in every country of the world, the companies are at risk, and in this case in particular, we are going to see much more of these actions in the near time, in the coming days. Qantas is analyzing furloughs as well. Several European companies as well. Here in Latin America, the wave of furloughs is really important. So the industry as a whole is being impacted by this, and we don't see anything in the future that is going to allow us to think that this is going to change in a short period of time.
What seems to be the main issue between the trade unions and the airlines is that the trade unions are trying to sell the idea that this collapse in demand is just a temporary glitch, and I'm using the word glitch in a very loose way, because they're saying, well, yeah, okay, there isn't enough demand, but once this is all over, then we're all going to be back to normal, and everybody will be needed in their job. Now, this is a position that is becoming increasingly difficult to support, because we are seeing that demand is simply not coming back, and not just because there are objective hurdles to people traveling, but also because the confidence at the moment is just not there, and it's extremely difficult to figure out how long it will take before confidence comes back. So I think it's starting to sink in pretty much everywhere, both on the corporate level and on the trade union level, that this is probably going to be here to stay for at least for the short term, for the next few years. And that's why there is this this battle to possibly find some more government money to extend it, but I don't see a lot of energy going in that direction. I think it's more about trying to minimize the damage, at least as much as possible.
Yes, you're right. There are several hurdles that need to be passed in this case. One is travelers' confidence. One is the health situation by itself, and then is the economy that what is worldwide impacted by this pandemic. I mean, to generate an illusion of a quick recovery right after the vaccine is discovered, for instance, it's quite a bit optimistic, if not unreal. I think that there are many economies in several countries that are going to be severely impacted. Recession is one of the keywords of this year in many places. So travel is going to have to wait. And besides that, one of the key things that the industry is losing now is corporate travel. And if companies around the world are going to find that they can do business without that much travel, one of the key factors of the industry is going to suffer. Leisure travel is going to bounce back, yes, once people have money back. But if the business is readapting to not traveling, this is going to impact a little deeper than everyone is expecting. I understand the position of the unions here. I mean, they are struggling with an outlook that when people are losing their jobs, they are not going to be able to find any. And if they find any other job, it's not going to be in the same conditions that the ones that they have now. I mean, this is going to pull salaries and conditions around the world. So the unions are going to be much weaker after this. But like I said before, it's quite optimistic, bordering on the unrealistic side of the analysis. If they are thinking that this is going to bounce back in a year or so, no one is thinking. Even airlines mostly are not thinking to be recovered in 2 or 3 years. They are aiming to 2025, to say the least, to be back to 2019 levels. So it's going to be a 5-year term that is going to be a loss for the whole industry.
I mean, from a Delta perspective, if we really want to look at that airline in particular, they were probably the airline that were in the best position among the 3 big in the United States. However, during the past 20 years, all U.S. carriers have had to rely more and more on international traffic in order sustain their level of profits. I mean, if we think that in the year 2000, more than 50% of worldwide passengers were domestic US. Now that is no longer the case, and as a matter of fact, the US domestic is not even the biggest domestic market in the world, as it has been overtaken by China. So it would have been a lot easier to face a crisis like this in a period like the early 2000s, where getting back US air traffic would have been a bit easier. Now, it seems to be very clear to me that at the very beginning, airlines thought they could just ride it out. They could just bleed cash for as long as it took for this to be over. But the more the months went by, the more they started to realize that this was just not going to be possible, because they were going to run out of cash before the crisis was going to be over. So these are the painful moves that they had to make, and this probably won't be the last. Delta may be the one that can get away with the fewer furloughs. I mean, we've heard about American Airlines. They plan on losing approximately 40,000 staff worldwide. So it could be like one of the smallest kind of job losses that we have in the next few months, and hopefully there won't be too many.
Absolutely, and when you see that a carrier is relying on international traffic, and it is what was severed in the first days of the pandemic, and you see that it is going to be the last thing that is going to be recovered, and even so, the main operation, that the moneymaker of the whole industry is the Europe-US link, and that is not going to be recovering anytime soon. So yes, the airlines that survive this are going to be much smaller, and their business strategy is going to need to change profoundly to survive this. But yes, Delta is one of the companies that were very prepared. I mean, even though they have important investments that are basically lost, Mexico, LATAM itself in Latin America, that money is almost gone. So perhaps that alliance and that investment in other carriers strategy is going to fail. But yes, the industry as a whole is going to be quite impacted by this.
I think an interesting development in Delta's story is that just as they were announcing these job losses, they also announced that they're planning to restart quite a notable number of international routes in summer 2021, and even starting in the winter 2020 season. So it's focusing mostly around Minneapolis, which is one of its hubs, and is adding routes to South Korea, to Japan, to the Netherlands, to Iceland, to the UK. So just as it's preparing to furlough almost 2,000 pilots, it's also kind of ramping up its recovery based on some projections from IATA and some expectations for when a vaccine may be ready. So I think it's interesting to see that they're planning to expand and to reestablish a number of routes, international routes no less, when international flying is suffering so much, and seeing that they're also going to furlough 1,900 pilots in just a few weeks, basically.
I think it's my vision, right? But I think that Delta is doing a smart move there, because they are trying to get a market that is going to be underserved just for the dynamics of this pandemic. I mean, there are many airlines that are going to abandon routes. So if they can consolidate on those routes, when other carriers are leaving, are departing, or are abandoning those routes, it is going to be smart for them to get there. It's happening in South America as well with LATAM's demise. I mean, there are several smaller carriers that are trying to get those routes. Is same with Avianca. And for the carriers that are going to be getting that market, they're going to be in the position to basically monopolize that specific routes. But it's smart. It's bitter and sad and painful that furloughs are happening. But in a case, if you think that in the enterprise side, in the route planning side, you need to go to where the money is going to be.
Well, at the end of the day, this announcement of new routes from Minneapolis is a very cheap positioning move from Delta. It doesn't cost them anything to say that they're going to be operating international routes in summer 2021. They are by far the biggest carrier in Minneapolis. All the destinations that they've announced, they're all existing destinations, meaning they have been served by Delta before, so they don't need to open new bases or to establish a presence in a new market. So it doesn't really cost them anything to say, yes, we're going to be flying there, apart from some planning, some planning paper. There isn't paper anymore, but it's just a planning exercise, and it's some piece of good news that is badly needed in this kind of environment. So, and at the end of the day, they are just positioning themselves to make sure that nobody is going to come into their turf and erode their market share in one of their fortresses. So it's a smart move, but I don't see that as a huge sign of a light at the end of the tunnel. I think it's still a bit far.
And don't forget the factor that you need to have a good news right after a bad news,
especially for the stock market.
Yeah.
Pablo, thank you for joining the podcast today. I've enjoyed the conversation. We hope we can have you on in the future.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
So, in the opposite spirit of putting some good news after bad news, we also learned earlier this week that ExpressJet, which is a rather major regional airline in the United States, has decided to close operations at the end of September. So first, some background to get people up to speed. ExpressJet was Embraer ERJ-145 operator for United Airlines. It, for the past few years, has worked exclusively under the United Express brand. It had contracts with American Eagle and Delta Connection in the past, and it's also done some of its own flying, but both of its other contracts have long expired or been terminated, and it hasn't really done its own operations in quite a while. So for a few years, it really relied on United for all of its business. And we learned in July that United decided to cancel ExpressJet's contract in favor of choosing Commute Air, which is the other 145 operator under the United Express brand, to continue as the sole United 145 operator. So ExpressJet was basically told that their services would no longer be needed, and once the CARES Act money runs out in September, the ExpressJet will basically be completely unable to support itself. So while it had hoped to fly maybe through the end of the year with United, it'll end up stopping flying on September 30th, and will furlough or cut all of the staff that it has, except for those that will facilitate its complete closing. ExpressJet represents what is the largest airline demise so far in the U.S. due to the coronavirus crisis. Before the crisis hit this spring, it operated about 100 aircraft or so. Its fleet consists solely of 145s. It did for a while operate the Embraer 175, but I think at the start of this year, maybe in January or February, it transferred all of those aircraft to SkyWest, which is another regional airline in the U.S. So for the better part of 2020, it's only operated one aircraft. and it employs about 2,500 people. So it's quite a substantial loss to have for many employees and for the industry as a whole. And for comparison, while ExpressJet had 100 plus aircraft and it had 30 more on order, Commute Air only has about 30 aircraft. And I'm pretty sure that ExpressJet has more 145s on order than Commute Air has planes total. Or at least it's exceedingly close. Commute Air might have one or two extra. But the size of the two airlines is quite staggering, like the difference between the two. And I think that while a good choice for United right now to keep Commute Air, since it's a smaller airline with lower fees, since it doesn't have to pay to keep as many aircraft on the ground, while it can fill more planes more full potentially. I think in the long term, once we start to recover in a few years, unless Commute Air can find some ways to add a considerable amount of aircraft to its fleet, I think as we start to see a recovery bounce back, especially domestically where many 145s are used, it could be difficult for Commute Air and for United to recover and to take back some of the market share that it had before coronavirus, which could allow other airlines to kind of pop up and snag back some of the market share that United used to have, like we might see Delta doing internationally.
It's interesting also to evaluate whether this means something with regards to the CPA business model that was used by ExpressJet. CPA means Capacity Purchase Agreement. There are several airlines in the US that operate this business model that is almost exclusive to the United States market. That means that there are carriers that operate aircraft normally carrying less than 76 seats, because that is a clause included in the labor agreement of many major carriers. And they only take care of operating the flights. They only take care of the operational side of the flight, and they leave all the marketing and distribution to the major carrier they fly for. So ExpressJet would not sell tickets per se, but they would provide flying to United Airlines in this case. Now, this model is used in order to make sure that those flights operated by smaller aircraft can be carried out with the lower total cost, because pilots, cabin crew, and all employees working for those companies, they have a different contract compared to the one that is used in major carriers, and those contracts tend to have a lot less perks and much lower salary levels. Now, as you said, John, ExpressJet was only operating Embraer 145. I mean, the Embraer 145 is a very specialist aircraft. It's a small regional jet. It wouldn't be a big problem to operate it in this kind of environment, because the price of fuel is pretty low, and we know that those kind of jets are fairly thirsty. However, we may not have enough demand to justify multiple daily flights to certain locations in order to feed hubs. So a network carrier like United, or like all the other network carriers in the United States, may find more useful to consolidate some of those flights and fly a bigger aircraft into the regional destinations, and just have lower frequencies, less connections, that may be able to serve the market that is out there anyway, because the demand is simply not what it used to be. The scope clause that is included in the contracts of most of the majors, as I said, requires all aircraft that have more than 76 seats operated by pilots and crews that have a mainline contract. And that includes every aircraft from an Embraer 175 and below that. So it's interesting to understand. It was a given that somebody had to leave the market. It was not possible to sustain all the CPA companies in the United States Unfortunately, it was ExpressJet that had to shut down, but it was always the writing was on the wall when this crisis hit, that the level of regional flying was not going to be sustainable. We have to wonder whether the CPA model is going to be modified by this, if this is just a bump in the road, or if there is going to be some other modification to the way it is being operated, especially bearing in mind that this is a model that is hardly replicated anywhere else.
I think it's important to note when we're looking at the size of the airlines that ExpressJet and Commuter are basically operating the same number of aircraft. At the time that ExpressJet's contract was canceled, the big difference between the two was that ExpressJet had so many more parked. So they had like 75 or so parked aircraft at the time they canceled their contract. I think it was when I first saw the announcement, I think I noted that it didn't say that everyone would be fired or laid off. There was like a distinction that most of our staff will either be furloughed or laid off come October 1st, which to me is an interesting point because it makes me wonder, are they planning to try something else here? Are they planning to completely shut down, or are they just cutting all of their crew staffs and furloughing some of them and hoping that in a few months, if demand starts to come back, maybe they can get a new contract, maybe they can start their own operations, maybe they can venture into some new type of operation that will allow them to exist into the future. So if they do work with another legacy carrier moving forward, I think I would be a bit surprised since they've already canceled contracts with really the three big legacy carriers in the US. And the other airlines here don't really work with regional carriers, with the exception of Alaska Air, who has Horizon. So I think it kind of leaves potential almost in the language of the announcement for ExpressJet to, whether it be in a few months or however long it takes, to start its own operations.
Well, I mean, you I don't know if you remember this. I mean, it may be a bit before your time. I'm kind of trying to say that I'm old, but there was a similar example in the early 2000s, after September the 11th, when of course the aviation industry was in a bit of a crisis. Atlantic Coast Airlines, that was operating more or less in the same with the same business model as ExpressJet. They tried to create a low-cost airline with Embraer 145, and that was a crazy idea. Was as crazy as it sounds. It didn't last too long. They lasted slightly more than a year. They were based in Washington Dulles Airport. I mean, I guess the good thing about them is everybody loved them. I mean, they had great customer reviews, but they had great customer reviews because they were offering a product for a fraction of the price it was worth. And obviously, every customer loves that. I mean, if a company offers me a product that is worth 100 and I pay 25, I'd be an idiot not to love it. And that's why they were getting a lot of very positive reviews. But unfortunately, in business, it normally doesn't work. At least in the long run, it at some point you kind of have to figure out that it just doesn't work. So that was their idea. I guess it was their idea because the early 2000s was the time of the low-cost airlines. Everybody was launching low-cost airlines, and some of them were being successful, some of them were not. But I promise you, those that were launched with Embraer 145 could not be successful because simply an Embraer 145 is not a low-cost airline. I mean, it may be possible to find some in some niche markets that can be operated profitably. It is a possibility. As I said before, now we are in a situation where fuel is not expensive, so operating an Embraer 145 is not necessarily a big issue, at least from a DOC point of view. But then again, it needs to be seen whether there's going to be a profitable niche that can be exploited using that kind of aircraft. And certainly the size that they had will be difficult to sustain for a startup operation. So that is one of the biggest problems that I see.
In its statement announcing its decision, the airline did mention that it's keeping some staff to both help with the wind down of operations and review the future of review future business opportunities, were their exact words. So it does seem that they want to keep going in whatever capacity they can. So if they do, it could be interesting. And I think if they do go for kind of the niche low cost business model, it'll also be kind of odd to see them jumping into that market just as Breeze will be, which is David Needleman's new startup airline. David Needleman, who started JetBlue in the U.S., who started Azul in Brazil, who has really made a name for himself in the airline industry and started multiple successful airlines. So I think if we have two new players that are attacking the same destinations in the same market, either we'll see one kind of do it better and come out on top, or we'll see kind of both of them bringing the other's demise by just kind of splitting the demand.
I mean, I do believe that ExpressJet is going to have a very blue sky thinking on this. They're not going to focus only on scheduled services. I mean, they could use their 145, reconfigure them as private jets, and set up some kind of net jets sort of operation. Depending on where you're based and what kind of airport you can fly in and out of, and the kind of markets you can tap into, that could be a possibility. I mean, operating domestic in the United States with a jet that can land pretty much on any runway, you don't have to focus on commercial airports, on commercial services. You could go private, you could go charter. I mean, there are some niches there that are quite profitable and that can be exploited. Like, for example, small sports teams. I mean, the Embraer are not necessarily that comfortable, but once the professional leagues they start operating again, that is something that could be considered.
Our last story covers some new ways that airlines and countries alike are trying to reopen their borders and restart operations despite the coronavirus pandemic. So as we've seen operations restart around the world, pretty much the de facto way to control the pandemic has been to require passengers from certain countries to quarantine for 14 days or to isolate for 14 days. But a number of countries and a number of airlines are placing bets on increasing their testing to reduce the time that people have to stay in quarantine, and therefore encourage people to travel, encourage people to take certain airlines.
Well, first of all, it is necessary. It's going to be paramount for the airline industry to do a much better job in communicating the actual risks that are involved in taking a flight, because there seems to be a popular belief that fuels a fear of flying due to high possibility of contracting COVID-19 because of infected people traveling and having to sit for many hours in a very constrained environment next to people that you don't know and may be infected. Now, to this regard, the International Air Transport Association, that is the association of airlines, has actually mandated their chief medical advisor, who is Dr. David Powell. Is a national of New Zealand that has worked extensively with the Air Force of New Zealand and with Air New Zealand as well, to actually dissipate some of the doubts that are being fueled by the press. If we actually look at the studies, at the scientific studies that have been made and published throughout the world about the possibility of spreading the pandemic or spreading the disease while being sat on an aircraft, it's actually quite clear that this isn't the case. We read in the press, at least here in Canada, I'm not sure about the United States, but in Canada we have regular reports of flights that have had people positive for COVID-19 on them. And the list of flights is being published on a regular basis. Now, there hasn't been any evidence of mass infection, of mass spreading through on these flights. According to studies that have been released by IATA, there have only been a couple of cases of multiple infection because of an individual that was COVID-19 positive and that traveled on a flight. That happened on flight Vietnam Airlines number 54 from London Heathrow to Hanoi on March 2nd. There was one primary passenger flying in business class that infected 2 other business class passengers, 12 economy class passengers, and 1 crew member. And also there was another flight that, whose flight number wasn't disclosed. It was flown with an A330. It was a 5-hour flight on March 3rd. There were 3 positive passengers, and then there were up to 11 secondary infections. Now, both these cases happened at the beginning of March, when flying with a mask was not a popular thing. No airlines had made mandatory, and some governments have even made mandatory flying with them wearing a mask throughout the entire flight. Since then, we really have had no cases of multiple infections on flights, and this is quite meaningful. However, it doesn't seem to have made it to the mainline news, to the mainstream news, because flying is still considered very dangerous, and is considered as dangerous as other means of transport when the technology involved is very different. First of all modern aircraft are equipped with HEPA filters, and there are filters that are hospital level. They filter out 99.9% of viruses and bacteria. The air is completely renewed every 2 to 3 minutes. There is a physical barrier between passengers. That is actually that are the seat backs. So, and one very interesting observation that was released by the doctor, based on the studies that have been published on the known cases of mass infection on flights, none of the people that have been infected were actually sitting next to the people that were infected, to the primary sick people. That means that having a policy that blocks the middle seat would have been absolutely useless. And it's an important piece of information. It's an important piece of news that needs to be sent out there. We know that some airlines have decided to keep their policy of blocking the middle seats and not selling the middle seat until, for example, Delta has decided to extend this policy until the end of January 2021. But from a scientific point of view, there is no evidence that is going to significantly decrease the likelihood of an onboard infection. And that is an important piece of information that needs to be communicated much better by airlines. With regards of the intention of the traveling or the would-be traveling public to fly, that of course is affected by restrictions to international mobility, and that obviously ties in with the quarantine topic that you've been talking about at the very beginning. Now, according to a survey by IATA, 83% of potential passenger would not consider traveling if they have to quarantine at each side of the trip. So a quarantine imposed by a country is essentially a travel ban. And that's why some of the countries that are experiencing some kind of control over the pandemic and whose economy is heavily dependent on tourism, they have put in place different measures in order to make sure that tourists can start again, go and visit their countries. And that is normally a layered approach of multiple measures that need to be taken. For example, some countries are requiring that passengers, before arriving at the airport, they take a PCR test, and that test needs to be negative. They either can take it with them or they have to upload it through a website before traveling. There are other conditions that have been imposed. Some of them are still maintaining a quarantine, but a much shorter one, meaning that passenger will have to take a second test after 48 hours or 96 hours after arriving at the destination, and if the test is negative, then they're free to roam at their destination as they please. You can see that it's based on a combination of tests or double tests at a certain interval, and possibly quarantine between one test and another. But that's not necessarily the case. Now, it's going to be crucial. It's going to be absolutely fundamental for these measures to become commonplace. That quicker and cheaper tests are going to be developed. Because at the moment, one of the problems is that the PCR tests that are administered through a nose swab, normally through a nose swab, they could take 24 to 48 hours to be performed, and that's a very long time for the reality that we're talking about. So we know that there are companies that are looking at different solutions, saliva tests, and some even breathalyzers that are coming out of companies in Israel. These tests will be fundamental to get international travel back, at least to a reasonable level of traffic, because otherwise it would be very difficult for airlines to plan or to at least hope for some kind of recovery.
Some of the most notable countries that are taking these actions include Iceland and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. So what those two countries are doing, as an example, is often requiring proof of a negative test before traveling to the country. And then once a passenger arrives in the country, they will take a second test, take a second sample, have that passenger, that traveler, quarantine while waiting for results. And then if that second result comes back negative, the person will basically be free to go and roam as they would like. I believe both of those countries are also implementing contact tracing. So I know the UAE is also having people install an app on their phones. So in case they develop symptoms down the road, or if they come into contact with someone who does have the disease, then the government can know where people are and where the disease is spreading, and take actions to combat that. Of course, certain destinations are being impacted more by this than others. So I think the UAE is kind of focusing its double test measures on a select number of destinations, like the United States, which is among the world leaders in infections right now. So if passengers are coming from Dallas or from Los Angeles, for example, they might be even more strictly traced or tested than travelers coming from places that aren't known to be hotspots, either in the U.S. or elsewhere around the world. So airlines and countries both are really banking on these measures to get people wanting to travel again and to incite people who don't want to wait 14 days and might feel better if they can only have to quarantine for 4 to 6 days.
And also, most of the Caribbean countries are implementing similar measures. Of course, quite a big number of those countries are heavily reliant on tourism income in order to provide jobs and subsistence to their population. Therefore, it's very important for them to restart their tourism machine. The same, so it's certainly happening for the Dominican Republic. It's happening, that is ready to experiment a breathalyzer kind of test that, according to what they say, can provide results within 30 minutes and has an accuracy of about 80%. And for a disease like this, 80% doesn't seem to be a number that inspires a lot of confidence. However, that is their decision. Some other countries, like for example Jamaica, they've decided to require a test for people coming from high-risk countries. Sometimes it's possible to do that test either on arrival or or before departing, and upload the result on a website, or bring with them the result. So this seems to be the way to go. I mean, the problem is the sustainability in the long run. If these tests need to be performed to thousands and thousands of people, those tests can be quite expensive. Even at the lower end of the spectrum, you're still talking about $30 to $50 for a PCR test. And that obviously, if multiplied by thousands of people a day, could end up being a crippling amount of money for small airports, small airlines, and small nations, and even not so small ones. So the travel industry, as I said before, is heavily dependent on fast and cheap testing methodologies that hopefully will be developed sooner rather than later.
I think many governments and many airlines will be focused on when the vaccine for the coronavirus can be released and approved and gotten out to many people. And I think, myself included, many people can agree that the vaccine is really going to be the thing that gets people confident in flying again and in traveling again. So I'm certainly watching the results of a vaccine closely and where they are in trials, and I'm sure many people are as well. We'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the AirlineGeeks Podcast. It's been a pleasure spending it with you. We hope that you will read more about all these stories on our website at AirlineGeeks.com and on our social medias on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at AirlineGeeks. We look forward to spending more time with you next week, and we hope that you will continue to join us both on our site and on our podcast for more stories.